Well, hello. I am Wayne Madison, and I have been drawing spiders for almost 50 years. And today I'd like to show you how I draw spiders, at least some spider bits. This is not intended to be a general lesson on biological illustration, although there might be some general hints or commentary that you could find useful. But I wanted to do it for those people beginning their careers drawing very tiny things, such as spider bits. That perhaps it'll give you a boost. What am I going to draw? Where did that thing go? I'm going to draw a bit of a spider that's here. Here's the little pickled spider. It is was collected a couple of years ago. It's been preserved in alcohol since. And I took a little bit of it that I'm going to draw. And I want to explain to you what this little bit is. And so we'll look over here. This is of a drawing I did long ago of a spider showing its legs splayed out just on the one side. And it turns out that male spiders, to transfer the sperm to the female, use their front feeler. So you can tell a male from a female spider by the fact that the males have that little front feeler, shown here, sort of swollen at the tip like a little boxing glove. And inside is, or underneath, is this complicated little apparatus. And that's what I'm going to draw, that complicated apparatus that males have. Okay. How am I going to do it? I'm going to do it with this compound scope. And a compound scope, you may be most familiar with their use for transmitted light, light coming from the bottom, going through a clear slide that has some sample in it, and then going into the objectives and then to your eyes. This, though, is a hard thing that's solid. It's not going to transmit the light well. So we're going to use incident light, light coming from above, that's then reflected up. And the spider itself, the spider bit, it's called a palp, is on a depression slide that you can see the image there, where the depression slide has a little bit of Vaseline on the bottom of it that was put there while it was dry, because otherwise it doesn't stick. And then alcohol that the spider bit is preserved in, put on top, and then and then the spider bit put on, this palp, set in place in the Vaseline, and then a cover slip covering it. Now, the reason that the cover slip is important is that an evaporating alcohol boundary with air that is also jiggling a little bit gets to be difficult to deal with, and also just the alcohol evaporates, and then you got to keep adding more. So you get a more stable image if you use a cover slip. The reason I use Vaseline is to hold it in place. There's some people that use things like a hand sanitizer, a gel of some sort. I don't tend to like that because it just tends to lean over just slightly. And I've been using this for years. I've been doing this technique with Vaseline for probably 40 years. And in fact, I've been using compound scopes in this way for about 40 years as well. So I've done this for a long time, so you just get used to what you do. Right. Okay, so I've got this little list here of things I want to say. Why are we doing this? Why are we going to draw this? Well, it's for publications, typically is the way reason I do it. I want to do this spider bit to show people what it looks like, because it helps us distinguish species. And in fact, this palp is a really good way to tell apart species, just as is the comparable bit on the female. So these are going to be for scientific purposes. They're going to communicate scientifically, these drawings. And so it's not so much about, making them look pretty or aesthetic, but I do want to do that because I want to show people how cool these things are. But they're primarily for scientific purposes. Given that, there are lots of different choices of styles that you could make. And I'm going to show you some older drawings that I did of, in fact, this exact same species that I'm going to draw to show you alternative ways to do it. So this is one of the very first ones that I did here of this species. And this is the underside with the little complicated bit here. And this is just a simple ink drawing. There's only a tiny bit of shading here. And when I look at this now, I think two things. One is, actually, we don't care much about these hairs. They're sort of they're there, you know, if you want to be fully accurate. The other thing is, if I were to have tried it to shade here, it would have taken a long time to get it exactly right with this style. This is pure black on pure white. And in the old days, you know, 50 or more years ago, the reproduction of pure black on pure white on paper was much easier to do than photographs, and much clearer, or things where there were shades of gray. And so the preference was always to have pure black on pure white, in which case, if you were going to do shading, you'd want to do it using little stipples or little hash marks. In other words, maintain the sense of pen. That takes a long time. So there was a trick that I used to use, my advisor used to use. It's still somewhat used in spiders. And it's to use this special board here called coquille board, which is a not too stiff cardboard that has a texture on it. It's got little bumps sort of randomly. And if you take a very dark pencil and you rub over top of it, only the top bits of the peaks of these bumps receive the black. And so it looks as if you spent tons of time stippling, but you actually didn't. You just rubbed it with a black pencil. And this technique is pretty cool. You can make some really nice drawings with it. You can make them look quite elegant. The texture is interesting. There are two reasons I don't do it anymore. One is that to get a very, very fine line for very fine details is difficult because you're fighting against the bumps. For these reasons, I don't do this anymore. And what I do, because it gives me the shading, it's quick, and modern technology, both digital obviously and newer printing technology, is perfectly fine with shades of gray. And so I use this. This is actually a different species, related, that is just simple pencil and ink. So I just use pencil for shading. So this is what we're going to go after. Now, I mentioned before that if you are wondering what you should include, like hairs and so forth, and you want to include everything, why not just take a photograph? And so it's probably a useful thing to talk a little bit about why I do drawings as opposed to take photographs, or in addition to take photographs, because photographs still add something. They're still good. They're useful to do. But why do I focus on the drawings? And the thing there is there's a couple of things. One is that a drawing and a photograph are really two quite different beasts. I tend to think of a photograph as being like data, and a drawing as being a theory. It's expressing my interpretation, my synthesis, my understanding of the structures. And I'm going to talk about this more as we go, but I think that you know, you probably know field guides, for instance, for birds, that are both in use photographs or use paintings. And a lot of people prefer to use the ones that have the paintings. And there's a good reason for that. It's that they can highlight in pretty subtle ways exactly what you need to tell a species apart. And so we're going to get into that idea of drawings as a theory, as a different means of communication as we go. The other reason, though, I like to do the drawings is that I learn so much more about the structures when I do the drawings. When you take a photograph, you know, you convince yourself, oh yeah, I looked at it. Or you just look at it. Oh yeah, I looked at it. Yeah, I got to see where the edges were, where the structures were, what shape. Yeah, I did. But you can convince yourself of that, but it's actually not true. You find that when you do a drawing, you're forced to confront what you don't know. You say, oh, I'm going to put the line. Oh, where was that line? Oh, I better go check. Oh. You're forced at every stage to go back and double check. And that means that you really notice the structures. You really learn it, you pay attention. Nowadays in science, you know, you might say, well, why do we need to learn so much? We'll just get our data quickly and publish it. And that's true. You know, the depth of knowledge isn't really encouraged compared to speed of publication. But if you're willing to put investment in and try to learn more about what you're doing, what you're seeing, then drawing is an excellent training for observations. Okay. I But there's another thing that you might wonder is, well, why not do a hybrid? Why not take a photograph and then add your theory on top of it? Go to Photoshop and put the lines and edges and highlight things and put the focus on. And that certainly can be done beautifully. It can be done very well. What I find, though, in the literature when I see that done is, and the way it's usually done is that the photograph is there. You can see the shading of the photograph and everything, but then the edges are highlighted with lines from Photoshop, for instance. There's some strange uncanny valley that turns up that way that makes me really, I find it more difficult to actually understand the structures, because the shading that's done that way is not the artist, the biologist, is not taking control of it. And so the shading tends to be this sort of like zombie-like fog in the background that I can't actually figure out what it's trying to say, what's going on there, is what it is. So as we'll see when I go on, I think that in the shading, for instance, there's a vocabulary that you develop to express certain things that's actually quite important, that clarifies what you're trying to do. So if you've got the time, then I think actually the drawing is better, like a pure drawing. Okay, we're ready to start drawing, but I'm actually not going to start drawing in the way that I typically would. This microscope has a fancy gizmo here called a drawing tube that allows you to get the proportions exactly right, so you know exactly where to put the lines. But I'm not going to start there. I'm actually going to start with some freehand drawing. And my suggestion for those of you starting is to do a lot of practice of freehand drawing first, before you rely upon fancy gizmos to give you the proportions and so forth. Practice with freehand, what it develops more than anything else is an eye. And an eye is the most important thing you have in doing drawing, much more important than the hand. And so it's basically to develop the skill of looking and seeing in comparison and know that you got it right. So we're going to start with some freehand drawing here, and I'll talk a little bit about how I think about it. And so here we've got, I'm not going to show you what I'm looking at directly, but well, actually, here it is. Yeah, that's what it looks like, more or less, under the microscope. And I'm going to do a freehand drawing, but before I actually do the drawing, I want to show you what I'm looking for. Because if you're going to be doing a drawing of a person's face, for instance, you're going to think, okay, I got to put the eyes, I got to put the nose, I got to put the mouth, I got to put the ears. If you had never seen a human before and you were looking at it, you'd suddenly say, well, hold on, is that mole the important thing? Is that little strand of hair sticking out this side the important thing? What am I supposed to focus on? And of course, we know what are the main bits of a human face and what we care about, what we notice. And so we focus on those and we orient our drawings towards those. The same is true of any biological thing. As a biologist, I know what I focus on. So I want to just show you really quickly we'll use this pencil here, the main structures here, and this is like super fast compared to the way I'd normally do it. This is just a pure cartoon. There. Okay, so this is the cartoon, and it turns out that there's this thing here. Okay, and it turns out that there's this little thing here. Okay, so the reason I'm showing you this is that we know the way that these spider palps work is that this bit here is the part that goes inside the female and actually transfers the sperm. This bit here is a part that locks into place on a particular part of the female to get the whole thing in the right orientation so that this thing, when it's ready to go in, can go in the right place. So these two things, it turns out, are not only critical in the function of this thing, but also often the most distinct between species. So we really care about drawing these accurately and paying attention to them, but we definitely have to show them. This bit back here and this bit here, for instance, and this edge really aren't that nearly important. So this bit here and this bit here are a lot like, for instance, the eyes of a person, or the size of the nose, or the exact width between the eyes, or the shape of the mouth. These are sort of critical bits to give the sense of the creature. There are also other bits that are important because they're standard structures that you need to know about. So this bit here turns out that it's a tube on the inside that actually holds the sperm before it comes out. So it's sort of like this hollow sausage. You definitely want to show these edges. You want to show this accurately. You want to show that accurately. You want to show where that is. And there's also a little, very subtle little valley up there whose edge you want to show. Now I know that these are the things that matter. So that's going to help orient how I do the drawing and what I prioritize. Okay, so let's just get going here. And I'm going to start with my finer pencil. You know, you always start with the finer implements for control, and you move later towards things that are bigger commitments like ink or wider implements, or at least that's the way I tend to go. So, okay, so I'm about to draw here, and because I said this isn't that important and that isn't important, this bit here is clearly the one to start to get first. I'm going to sort of try to get that edge of the whole thing. If I can figure out how to put this beside the image of my the movie of my drawing this. If I can figure out how to put it beside the photograph on the movie, I'll do it. Okay, so then this comes like this, and this goes like that. And you know, we got our little thing here. I'm going to do this. This is like way faster than I do. You might wonder, well, why would I ever do freehand? Well, as I said, it's a learning tool to learn how to look at spiders and develop your sense of shape. But there are also times when I'm visiting a museum somewhere and I really want to do a sketch, but they don't have available at that moment a microscope, for instance, that has the fancy stuff, or not quite the right photography setup or whatever. And so, you know, freehand sketch is a good thing to do. At least I've got that. So I look at this and I realize there are a couple things wrong. I think this distance from here to here is too long compared to the thing, etc. So there's another thing going on here, which is that you probably can't see, but there's actually two spikes here. There's this spike coming up, and then there's another spike that's actually, it's forked. You can't see that edge very well, but it's just split off that way. And so this is the way it is. So, you know, if this were for real, I would start to, you know, shorten this thing, correct it, and so forth. But as you can see by the way that I'm talking, I'm paying attention to proportions. I'm doing measurements in my mind's eye about how wide this is, how long this is this 3 times that, is that half of that, and so forth. So you'll build these ruler measurements. But there's also a general sense of it, a gestalt of it. It's like, is it too fat? Is it too tall? And that's something that's really hard to explain in general terms, because it probably is very context dependent. We know with human faces that we've got this whole sense inside of us as to the variability of human faces, and what's a wide face and what's a narrow face and so forth. So when we look at a face, we just have this sense, is it wide or narrow and so forth. And so we without even thinking about it, if we were to draw, we'd think, oh, that looks like somebody else. I made a mistake. I've made their face too narrow. I've made their eyes too far apart or something like that, because we're really attuned to the variability in human faces. And so the sense as to whether something is too wide or not, or too tall or something like that, also will come in you with time as you continue to draw. And that's especially developed as you're doing freehand drawings, because you're really paying attention to them, right? That, oh, it's not quite, it's just not quite right. Other species look this narrow, but not this one. This one looks wide, and I want to show that it's wide. So that's the freehand version. It's a really good idea to learn how to do freehand drawing. And the reason is, even when you can get the proportions right, it turns out that there's some very fine bits where that eye for proportions steps back in. And if you've never developed it, you're going to make mistakes once you start relying upon photographs or fancy methods and so forth. Okay, next we're going to do the fancy stuff to do the proportions. So this is going to use this thing that I mentioned to you that's called the drawing tube. I'll show it to you here. So the way that it works is that there are, and I think I can, the way that it works is that there are two light paths. There's the standard path of the image of the spider coming up through here to our eyes, but there's a prism in the drawing tube that means that the drawing tube is looking at your piece of paper, and the image of the paper hits that prism, goes across, goes into the box where the light's coming up from the spider, and there's a half mirrored prism there, which means that it then joins the light coming up to your eye. So you see simultaneously the spider and the paper, and you basically can trace. So I'm going to see if I can set up a little camera here going at the same time that shows you what I'm seeing. Okay, we have the drawing tube set up, and you can see there what I'm seeing through the microscope, more or less, of the spider palp. And as I said, there are two light paths now, but I haven't turned on the other one yet. And I'm just going to do this slider here, and you're going to see how the image changes. And the reason is now you can see the pencil there. This is not the size that I would normally do it, because it turns out just the optics of the camera setup requires me to put it at a much smaller magnification. You can change the relative magnification of the paper and the spider, and it's just the wrong combination. Of course, I have to tape the piece of paper down now because I'm about to start tracing in a sense, right? So I'm going to just go in there. Oh dear, this is going to be tough because of the optics, I can't actually see the pencil clearly. The pencil to me is not in focus. I think it's going to be in focus on the image you see, but it's not in focus to me. So I can't actually see the tip of the pencil. Of course, normally when I'm not trying to make a movie of it, I could set it up so I can see both in focus at the exact same time. But I think you get the principle that what I'm doing is I'm basically going through, and with this fine tipped pencil, so I have lots of good control, and I know that there's a little membrane across here, but I can't actually see it because of where, okay, hold on, it's right about there. I can't see where the pencil is exactly. I'm gonna switch now and actually do it in the way that I actually like to do it. Okay, and now we're gonna start again. So at least you'll see the drawing. You won't see what the specimen looks like directly, but you know that I'm tracing it. So, okay, so this, as I said, is the critical bit. This is this bit here is the equivalent of the eye of a person, right? This is the one that I want to make sure I get really accurately. So this is where the theory rules, where it's like, I know that that's an absolutely critical thing to show. And so to get this exactly right, where do I put the line? So here, just think about this for a moment. Let's suppose this were the actual edge of a structure, right along there, as you see it. When I'm doing the line, and I'm going to use a thicker pen than here, when you're doing a line, do I draw the line right, like do I try it like right over top, just to the outside, or just to the inside? And those will make different drawings. They'll be different. And so remember, the idea is that the actual structure is here, coming this way, and this is its edge here. Well, the one that's the best to control, the easiest to control, is actually to do it just on the inside, so that the outermost bit of your pencil is just touching the edge. So that then later when we re-ink it, we just know that's the one to do. But what you can see here is that the thickness of a line makes a difference when you're talking about a really delicate bit of structure. And so that thickness of a line, and exactly where you put it, and whether you're just a teeny bit outside or not, even though we're getting the overall general exact proportions, because we're using this fancy device, that thickness of the line can make a difference, and you make tiny little mistakes. And then you stand back and you look at it, and you might think, oh, looks good enough to me. But if you've developed your eye by doing a lot of freehand work, by paying attention to the structures, then you might notice that it doesn't feel right. It looks too thick, it looks too thin, even though it's almost right. If this thing here looks too thick or too thin, anybody using your work later will misidentify the species, because your drawing will look like the thing is chubby, but it's actually thin. Or at least the subtle difference is enough to get confused about species. Okay, so and this goes back to this difference between photographs and drawings. A photograph is actually quite difficult. It's more difficult to interpret than you might think. And sometimes it's because there are bits and pieces of things that just by chance don't happen to show up really clearly on the photograph. You know, it might be that oh, this thing is just covered by a bit of gunk, or oh, this is a little darker than normal on this specimen, and so it obscures a line. Or maybe the angle isn't quite right to see the edge of something. Or whatever. Sometimes it's just hard to see certain things in a photograph. But you might be able to see them by focusing up and down. You might be, which a photograph can solve by doing image stacking. You might be able to solve it by looking at different specimens. You might be able to solve it by looking at the same specimen from a different angle. So when you do a drawing, you can actually figure out, one way or another, where exactly that edge is and show it, even though it wouldn't have been visible on a single photograph. So that's one thing. You can synthesize knowledge in a drawing. But the other thing is that there are sometimes biases in how we look at things that a photograph doesn't correct. And one of the things that those of you that know and love certain groups of spiders, like jumping spiders, might have noticed is that there's a very common mistake made in illustrations of spiders. So this, by the way, this drawing is much scratchier than I would normally do it. I'm a scratchy drawer. I'm not the sort to just do a single continuous line perfectly. I tend to scratch and erase and correct. Different people are different in this regard, but I'm a scratcher. But you may notice that there's a common mistake in published drawings of whole jumping spiders that are alive, like where you see the spider like this or something like that. And the mistake is that many illustrators show the legs going to too narrow of a point. They look like they're going to a tiny little point. And you'll see this in, well-regarded books, nature guides, and so forth. My assumption is that in almost all cases, these are drawings taken from a, just double checking to see that I got everything there, taken from a photograph. So if it's taken from a photograph, how did it get it wrong? How did it get it, and I don't actually really know. Given the ambiguity of the photograph, especially if things aren't perfectly in focus, maybe that's why, because of this preconception as to how spider legs are built, that they're drawn as if they go to a point. Okay, I took away the tape because I'm now about to do the outer line on this, and I'm going to start with not the thinnest of my pens. So I use 3 thicknesses of pens, 0.005 for very, very delicate thing, but my 2 workhorses are 0.1 and 0.3. I tend to use the Staedtlers because they are better on water-resistant paper. They don't seem to beat up as much as the Micron Pigmas, but for this sort of drawing, they're both great, Staedtlers or Micron Pigmas. But I'm going to use not the very finest, but this one because it gives me more control than the 0.3. I will end up using the 0.3 over the same lines that I built this, but I want to start with this because this is where I want the control early on in this process. And so where I'm going to go, by the way, now that I've got that, I'm going to take that away so I see a little bit more clearly through here, and I'm gonna start here. I'm going to try to do it so that I'm on the outside of the line that I drew. So as I was saying, there's this persistent mistake that's made, not all illustrators, but you just see it frequently enough that you wonder, of drawing jumping spider legs being too pointy, going too fine of a point. Now, that's what seems to, the illustrator seems to do by, if they take it straight off of a photograph, or at least it's a common mistake, which means that the photograph is not communicating to them, for whatever reason, the actual, or not communicating clearly, the actual leg widths towards the tip. But if I were to, knowing what I know about jumping spiders and using both the photograph and, say, preserved specimens and my background knowledge, to do a sketch myself from that, I would do it with the legs to the correct width all the way down. So let's suppose I did that. I did a sketch, and it could be really cartoony, or just the outer sketch. If I were to then hand that to the illustrator and say, could you copy this? They'd get it right, probably, because the drawing was crystal clear as to exactly where the edges were, which tells you that a drawing, by virtue of being a synthesis and containing a theory, can be clearer about certain aspects of the world than a raw photograph can. The same way that a chart can be clearer than absolute raw data, because it's adding our wisdom to it. Okay, so I'm going to just keep going around like this. I'm actually going to, because I'm talking to you guys, I'm not really paying attention the way I normally do, because normally I would finish this bit at the tip here, this spike, the most critical bit, before I go around here. But I'm going to do this now. Remember, I'm using the finer of the two major pens to get this exactly right. So this is where I really sort of sweat to get these proportions right, because this is the equivalent of drawing the eye of a person. Right? Now, I've got this conundrum here, though, because I told you that there were two spikes here. There's this major spike here, but there's this other spike here that's sort of separated from by a fork right here, and it goes back this way, and it's underneath. So do I just sort of just draw it like that, show you it's underneath? And I don't actually. What I do is I'm going to take the finer one. I'm going to draw this line, but so that it comes all the way right to there, and it doesn't actually touch the others. Now, if I look at the specimen, it looks like it just touches the other, right? Because it's going completely underneath. It actually extends about this far, right up to about there. But I'm not going to draw that. I'm going to actually leave a little bit of a break. And this is the first example where this is a theory. It's not data. We're actually going to show something that's not there, because it communicates our ideas better about how the structures are related. So, okay, now that I've done this really critical bit here with a fine pen, I'm just going to do a couple of little finishing touches with even the finer one. It turns out that there's this little transparent bit at the top that I want the finest one. And it turns out that there's this membrane here coming across here that I want to get that way. But everything else I can be a little cruder with, right? So I'm going to go straight to the 0.3 now for everything else. And because of the way my hand works, I like to turn the paper so that the natural curve of the drawing is concordant with the curve of the specimen. I'm not good at trying to draw a concave thing in this orientation, so I keep turning the thing around. And here I'm obeying the rule that the pencil is on the is just on the inner edge of the actual edge of the thing. But I don't mind being a little too thick on this structure, thicker than it really is, because that's actually a critical structure. And so I'm going to emphasize it by making it a little thicker. In the end, these drawings, all of them, are a little bit of a cartoon, which is a little bit like saying it's a little bit of a theory. It's actually reflecting things that we want to highlight, not exactly what we see. And I'm doing this. This is not my usual care, but that's okay. I think you'll get the idea. And I'm also going to leave a little break there. And see, I didn't actually come to there. I didn't come to there. I didn't touch it there. And there's a very specific reason for that. Okay, so we got that. I'm going to go back to the point 1 because these lines are a little bit more subtle in nature and they're not that important, so I don't want to highlight them. So I'm going to do them as slightly narrower ones. And there's some weird little stuff going on here. And there's stuff that there's a little bit of wrinkling here, but with the finest pen. Okay, so it turns out now I'm going to let this dry because I'm going to want to erase some of the scribbles. This is actually where the freehand practice was useful, because now I can look at this and I can decide, given the error of the thickness and exactly where I put it, that looks right or it doesn't look right. And I gotta say, as I go back and look at it, it's actually pretty good. I think that this bit here, I did a little too far out. I think this thickness is a tiny bit too much. But if I was doing it more slowly and more carefully, I would have corrected it before I inked it. Okay, so we're now gonna go and hope that I let it long enough to dry so I don't smudge the ink. And of course, I'm focusing mostly on these inked bits, but you'll wonder, well, what am I going to do about the bits that I didn't ink, like this line and all that? Well, what I typically do for that is I just make them much softer, because I will want to keep those, because those are telling me where things are, but those things are going to be pencils and shading, not inked. Now I want to go in order of priority. So I start with the equivalent of the eye, namely this bit here, and get that exactly the way I want it. Now I'm going to go back over with the thick pen. But of course I'm doing it from the inside, not going to the outside of the thing. I'm going to go up to about there. And this comes here like that. Okay. So now here I can just use the pen directly to shade, because this is so black. And I do tend to disobey reality a tiny bit here. I tend to make this terminal bit darker than it really is, because this is where I want the eye to go to. This is like that critical shape here, exactly how that is. But now what do I do with the second spike, the hidden spike, the one behind? And I'm going to do the following. I'm going to actually do it with the finest pen I've got. It turns out that actually, if I were to look at this from an oblique angle, I would see a gap there. But because we're looking at it like this, there is no visible actual space between them. It's just one is over top of the other. That I'm going to draw this so that there's just the thinnest of white lines there. Okay. Now there is no white line in reality there. And this is a convention that we have that basically says when one structure is over top of the other structure and you want to show the edge and show that the one is over top of the other, you act as if there's a tiny little white fog over the structure above that then leaves a halo showing that, for instance, this line is broken by that line, meaning that this line here is above that line. And now we continue. Okay. And there's this thing here, but we're going to do that as shading. Okay. Um, so that is the critical bit of stuff going on there. And now we're ready to start using pencils for shading. And I like mechanical pencils rather than, sharpened pencils because I want the control and detail. But I've got my main fine HB pencil, so medium soft, medium hard, for the initial sketch, but also fine control at this point. Then I've got that's a 0.5. These are 2.9s, so a fair bit thicker. These are my shading pencils, my primary shading pencils. This is soft, so it's dark. It's a 2B. This is an H, so it's harder. So this is for it might actually be an H. No, I think it's an H. So these are 0.9. So therefore, shading of broader areas and getting it either dark or medium. And then this is the broadest one that I've got, but it's like a 2H or a 4H or something. I don't remember what it was. And so that's for faint grays, but doing a broad area and trying to avoid looking like you're doing a lot of scratching. Okay, so I do that. And what I typically do is I start with my finest one first because I want to make sure that I get the edges, the boundaries right? So where this is going to matter the most right here is right here. Oops, I should have erased that. Is right here where we've got this membrane over top of this. And since this edge is above that, I'm going to leave a white line along there, along that side. Along the other side, not, right? So I can just sort of continue the black of this, right? I can continue that here, and then this is sort of going to be just sort of, just a medium gray, and so forth. But I now want to leave, and this here is going to be coming gray, but I want to leave the white line. And so since I have more control with this pencil, this is the pencil I'll use for it. Right, so I define that edge. And now I can switch to another one. Now that I've used this fine one to define the edge, I can switch to one of the other ones. And so as you might expect, I want to be controlling the exact shape of that lead, and so you'll notice it's sort of angled a bit because I do this, and this gives me the more even, not scratchy look. Okay, and so we're gonna go like this, and whether you go from dark to light or light to dark, it's it's up to you. I tend to go from dark to light, so normally I wouldn't have done this except that I wanted to worry about this edge and get that right first. So that the membrane disappears there, so we can go there. So I'm going to switch back to continue with my dark to light tradition, the way I tend to do it, is that I'm going to go back to here, and I'm going to first put that line. So this is actually what you're seeing here is actually the tube that carries the sperm. It's on the inside. You're just seeing it sort of shadow through there. And then I'm cutting corners here, but that's okay. Just to show you the general idea. Okay. There's actually some cool little things going on here. There's actually a bump here, which, has got some wrinkles defining it and so forth. I could have spent more time on that. I might have put a little bit of ink on there, very fine ink, just to show the crispness of those wrinkles. But I'll just keep going now. So now this comes like that. And I'll just prepare it. I'll get as far as this dark one wants to go before I hand it back to the medium one. By the way, this is not the paper I usually use. This is what we tend to use in natural history museums, a label paper. What I actually like drawing on is a hot press 300-pound watercolor paper. I tend to use the Darshes, but it's a very smooth watercolor paper. But it means not only is it stiff and solid. This is a little too thin for me, a little too transparent. But the watercolor paper is also acid-free and lasts a long, long, long time. Okay, so this bit here, which is called the embolus, is almost ready. I just have to do the little bit of shading at the very tip to let it fade from gray. Okay, so we got that. And now we're going to go do the rest of this bit. And I'm going to do this actually more. Oh, by the way, you'll notice the sense here of this line here being the one spike beneath the other spike. If I had made an error there, and sometimes it happens, you can always use a bit of a gel pen and then go in and do your ink again and sort of fiddle. So that's the way to reverse course a little bit. You could go all the way back with erasing and all that, but I don't go that far. But you can't go back and erase if it's the ink. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the darks, and now I'm going to be doing this bit. And here you'll notice that I'm just going to start doing the whole rim. There's an inner dark there, one line there. That is the one edge of the sausage, the tube that's containing the sperm. It sort of comes up like this. It's there, so this is quite dark. And then this edge is, I'm going to do that a little less dark. And this is going to be just sort of a gradient in here eventually. But there's also just quite a bit of, it's fairly dark along here. I think I might have normally have put a little bit more of a thickness on that pen line on the outside, because I want that to be bold. Even if it's bolder than reality, this is the important structure to put the eye on. This thing here. This stuff here isn't that important, and this stuff is sort of important, but we spend most of our time looking at this from a different direction. So it's that other drawing where I pay attention more to that. Okay, so now we're going to come here like this. We're going to do some bit of shading. And then we're going to hand it off to the next color of gray for the rest of that. And I don't mind exaggerating a little bit the darkness of this thing, because I remember that I said that there are a certain set of structures that you want to make sure that I know about, that I know I want to convey, that if you were a naive illustrator that didn't know spider bits, you might not know about, but if you've been studying spiders for a while, you'd know that there's a certain things, and this tube here is one of them, that I might exaggerate its clarity just because I know it's there, and that's one of the things that a drawing can do. It can draw attention to the exact position of that. So my goal here is to not make this look like a photograph, otherwise I just take a photograph, but actually convey the structures. But there is a little bit of a compromise here, because in the end I want this drawing to do two things. One is that it can convey to somebody that wants to understand the structures where they are. And the second thing is to convey what it generally looks like if you just take a glance at it, because these sorts of drawings will be used by biologists to try to identify species. And so for that, you want the thing to look more or less the way the next specimen will look when you look at it. But just as with a bird painting in a field book, the best way to show what the next specimen will look like and clarify that is not necessarily to take a photograph of this specimen. It's to actually do a drawing that synthesizes and clarifies the things to look at, to highlights. So that's what we're doing. I forgot to put an edge here in the inking. That's okay. We'll worry about that later. We won't worry about it in this one. If I was doing this seriously, I would have fixed that. Turns out that there's a line there that I might have done with ink. Okay. I'm going to deal with this later, partly because I'm worried about smudging. So, like, you know, some people, and this is actually a good idea, will have an index card or something they'll place over top. So as they're moving their hand, they're not smudging. And I should actually do that, but I'm just a little too lazy. Okay, so now we're going to do this, and it turns out that this is sort of broadly shaded like this. So I find, oh, also the other thing is, that might not be clear to you, that there's actually a white patch here. There's actually a patch here that is much paler than the rest. Seems to have no pigment at all, except for a couple of wrinkles in it. And so I'm going to color up to that. And so that patch actually turns out to be an important thing in these species. So that actually, I'm going to exaggerate its whiteness a little bit. Right? So I find this bit here really tough. And there are different responses you can have to this. And the reason is, I find it really tough to do it delicately enough without showing the scratches. So the one thing you can do to minimize the damage is to actually draw the lines to be concordant with the texture that the beast actually has. So there's little wrinkles here that tend to be oriented in the same way that I'm doing the scratching. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is later with a smudge tool, you know, something like this, or this smudge tool, to sort of smooth it out. This is likewise an issue of being a little quick and dirty. I don't tend to use the smudging, partly because I find that when I smudge here, there's this transition between pale smudged to darker non-smudged that's a little bit more particulate looking, and it's just a little too weird to me. So if I were going to use smudging in general, what I would do is actually do a broad wash underneath of smudged. So I would basically have, it would be almost like putting a watercolor base. It would be basically just sort of having the pencil smudged broadly, and then on top of the broad smudge, add the dark stuff. So it would become a two-layered process, all pencil, but the under one being smudged all the way. But since I don't want to do that, I'm too impatient, and I don't want this transition between smudge and non-smudge, I tend not to smudge. I tend to just try to be really delicate. The other way to do it would be to use this last pencil that I told you about. That is the really thick one. And if I get that flat enough, and it's a very hard pencil, so it's very pale, I can do a pretty pale thing. So maybe this is what I should have done instead, but you know, something like that. Why not? So you'll develop all your own ways of doing these things. And one of the keys is that you'll notice that I'm saying things like, well, it's not really, it doesn't really look like this, but I'm going to draw it this way for emphasis. I'm going to do this. You develop your own vocabulary. And an absolutely critical thing is to think about that vocabulary, choose it, and be consistent. So as I said, in some species, in some specimens, this isn't so clear, but I tend to draw it in a similar way for everyone, or at least a little bit more similar than it actually is, because I want to say, here it is. Here's this thing we all know about. I tend to, likewise, there is no white line, but I say it because I want to communicate this edge overlying another object. So you build up a vocabulary that means that your drawing is part-way reality and part-way this superimposed vocabulary that isn't quite real, that isn't the way it looks. So back in the old days, when we had to use pure black on pure white, you might have done this with some cross-hatching stuff, right? You might have done something like this to do shades, you know, either like that or like that. And you'll see drawn illustrations from the past like that. Well, that's perfectly fine to do. What you have to do, though, is make it really clear that this is so stylized that it's not real. You don't want somebody to misinterpret this as meaning that the surface of the thing actually has cross-hatching. But because you treat this as a very clear artificial vocabulary that you're using to communicate darkness, once somebody gets used to looking at your drawings, which doesn't take long because you're going to be very consistent that this is more stylized than reality, that they'll know that that's shading, not texture. Right? And so likewise, after a while, people that you know, are used to these things, they'll know that these bits and pieces are not exactly the way I'm drawing them, but I'm communicating the bits and pieces more clearly than if I had shown it exactly the way they look. Okay, so I feel like I'm chattering on along here with this. just so much to talk about. All these little wrinkles and stuff, and I didn't quite get all this right done when I did the thing in the first place. I forgot to draw some lines in here, etc. Okay, so I'm going to leave this like this. You know, I would have put more details. I would have made this smoother and so forth. So I'm just going to declare victory on this bit. And now this other bit behind, these two other bits behind. There are three major structures here. There's this bit, there's this other segment below, and there's this big thing here that basically is like a cup that contains this bit, right? So let's first of all deal with this cup. It's called a symbium. And I want to deal with this. So this is, on top here, is there's a valley down here in which this thing sits. And I want to show the ridge that's the top of the valley. And I'm just going to take this pen here and go like that. So that's where that ridge is. Now the ridge doesn't look like that. It's not a dark line. But this again is a convention. This is like anybody that knows jumping spiders will know that there's a valley there and that there's a ridge there. And they'll understand that this is what I'm meaning by that. Strangely enough, I'm not going to shade any of this. Even if this were black, I wouldn't shade it. And the reason is I want to draw attention to this. This is really where things are. And this is, even if it were black, the general shape of it means something, but the shading really doesn't mean much. Or if it does, it's not that important. And well, my computer glitched there for a sec, so I lost the video feed. So we'll get back here. This bit here, I do want to show because, as I said, at some point, this bit here, I'm going to say we're done for now. This is the cake coming out of the oven. So, as on a cooking show, you know, this is the one I did for real a week ago. And so this is the formal drawing that I did with the side view as well. And this is what we did today. And you'll notice there is a bit of a difference of shape there. I said that this was relatively too thick, and it is compared to that. Here we show it a little bit better. Here I make that gap a little bit clearer because there is a tiny bit of the gap showing right there. So there is the drawing that we've done. And you know, you write down the data there, and I always write down the data just below it so that when I do my digital scan of this, because of course this is going to become digital at some point, to be composed into a plate and so forth. I use Illustrator to compose the plates, Photoshop to do some editing of this, and then Illustrator to compose them into plates. You want this scan to be here for the record of exactly what specimen it is and what your magnification was and so forth. And of course, when it comes to the publication, I end up cutting this out, but at least there's a record digitally for all of that stuff. So thank you, and I hope you have a great time doing drawings of spiders and other things. Enjoy.